This is the Cold War in 10 minutes. After World War II, there was tension between the USA and USSR. This would define the next 40 years of global politics. The two sides were stuck in an arms race, proxy wars, and espionage until the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. In this video, we'll go over how it started, why it was called the Cold War, the key differences between the two superpowers, and how it ended. Make sure to watch till the end, because you're going to want to know how it ended. World War II had come to an end, and the Allied powers met together at a series of conferences to discuss what to do with Germany and Europe in general. The three big powers were the US, UK, and USSR. They agreed to divide Germany into zones of occupation. But things quickly fell apart when it came to deciding what to do about Eastern Europe. The USSR had millions of soldiers stationed in these areas, and Stalin wanted to make them into friendly communist states like the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, the Western powers wanted to restore democracy in these states. There was just no common ground. So, each side did their own thing. So now you have two separate spheres of influence in Europe. On one side, you have the Soviets controlling Eastern Europe and Central Europe. And on the other side, you have the Americans controlling Western Europe. Now that the war was over, the US didn't want to get involved in another European war. They thought isolationism was the best approach. But this proved difficult because they shared the democratic ideals of freedom of speech and religion. That meant that they couldn't turn their backs on Western Europe, who was trying to resist communism. And so the US created a plan called the Truman Doctrine. This was a foreign policy that committed the United States to help any nation threatened by communism. This would lead to the US funneling billions of dollars to nations all over the world. As for the Soviets, they also wanted to spread communism throughout the world. But that's not what they wanted in Europe. They could control Eastern Europe directly. Instead, they wanted to build up their army to be able to defend against any future Western attacks. After all, the war had devastated their country. The US wanted to rebuild Western Europe because without those countries, Germany wouldn't be able to wage war against the Soviet Union. And even if Germany did attack the USSR, they had nuclear weapons. And speaking of nuclear weapons, let's talk about the arms race. As soon as the US dropped the bomb on Japan, Stalin knew that he needed to develop his own bomb. If he didn't, then the US would have an advantage over the Soviets. In 1949, the USSR successfully tested their first atomic bomb. This was a shock to the United States, and it spurred them into developing their own hydrogen bomb. The Soviets also developed an H-bomb in 1953, and then both sides began building up their arsenal of weapons. Today, 89% of all nuclear weapons belong to either the US or Russia. It's crazy how much these two countries have. Okay, so the US and USSR have nuclear weapons. They're also the two biggest economic powers in the world, and they're competing against one another to show who's better. Well, the US had capitalism and the USSR had communism. In the US, businesses were privately owned, and in the USSR, everything was controlled by the state. Both systems worked well in their own way. However, they both had some problems. Capitalism worked great for the US economy, but the gap between the rich and poor was growing rapidly. And then, in the Soviet Union, everyone was equal. But no one was very happy, because there was no incentive to work hard. Both sides tried to argue that their system was superior, and it got pretty heated. They constantly criticized one another in the UN. And it wasn't just the governments that were engaging in this battle of ideologies. There was massive propaganda from both sides to demonize the other. For example, here's a Hollywood film depicting how awful communism is. And here's some Soviet propaganda showing how bad capitalism is. Alright, now let us talk about the Berlin Crisis of 1961. This was a turning point in the Cold War where it almost became hot. Remember how Germany was split into 4 zones after World War II? Well, the western part of Berlin was also split. This map shows how divided the city actually was. There were checkpoints everywhere. Imagine you're living in East Berlin and you want to visit West Berlin. You need to walk through multiple checkpoints, be questioned and show proper documentation. People were fed up with this. Between 1945 and 1961, 3.3 million East Germans fled to the West. That's a huge number, considering that they only had 17 million people at the time. So East Germany built a wall around the city. This was supposed to stop people from leaving. It's estimated that over 100 people died trying to escape East Berlin. So the Soviets made a statement. All right, so the US and USSR are constantly arguing. They have nuclear weapons and they're building up their militaries. Are we on the brink of World War III? You might think that these leaders are crazy and just want to cause a nuclear holocaust. But there's something called mutually assured destruction. If the Soviet Union attacked the United States, then the US would retaliate and destroy the USSR, and vice versa. Both sides realized this, and so no one wanted to strike first. This led to a stalemate. They both had powerful weapons, but no one used them. In order to break this stalemate, both sides began launching satellites and going to space. The US launched Sputnik, the first satellite, and this caused a panic. If the Soviets could launch a satellite, then they could also deliver a nuclear payload. This led to the creation of NASA. Then in 1969, Neil Armstrong became the first man to walk on the moon. This was a huge win for the US. They beat the Soviets to the moon. And shortly after this, President Richard Nixon resigned due to the Watergate scandal. The new president was Gerald Ford, and he wanted to improve relations with the Soviet Union. He introduced a policy called This was a relaxation of tensions between the two superpowers. Ford and the Soviet leader signed a few treaties, but then the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and this caused a huge rift between the two sides. By the 1980s, Mikhail Gorbachev was the leader of the Soviet Union. He wanted to reform the communist system and introduce some capitalist ideals. He hoped that this would save the failing Soviet economy. However, this made him very unpopular with the older generation of communists. These reforms included perestroika, which restructured the government, and glasnost, which allowed for more freedom of speech. These reforms backfired and caused more problems for the Soviet Union. And then out of nowhere, the Berlin Wall came down in 1989. This was a huge blow to the Soviet Union. They lost their biggest ally in Eastern Europe. Gorbachev stepped down in 1991 and the Soviet Union collapsed. The Cold War was finally over. And so, that's the Cold War in 10 minutes. The two superpowers never went to war against each other, but they spent a ton of money on weapons, and it affected every single nation in the world. What do you think of the Cold War? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and check out my other content. Thanks for watching!